panel, we need to understand a couple of terms in this motion, and that will help us fully show you from side like proposition why it is a better way to incentivize the youth to be more entrepreneurial if we were to offer them tax breaks as opposed to AF mechanisms. Now, one, what do we mean when we talk about incentivizing youth entrepreneurship? This means that we are trying to actively motivate the youth within society to look for mechanisms that offer economic opportunities for them, for like the more people like them in society. This means like businesses cropping up, ideas in various sectors to do with agriculture, finance, and tech, and what have you. How are we going to incentivize that culture of entrepreneurship within the youth? One. Now, two, when we're talking about tax breaks, we're talking about some certain forms of deductions or like lesser harsh tax mechanism existing for these young like youth-led entrepreneurial companies. And why is this important is going to like show up more in my speech when I talk about my model. We also need to understand what financial security for the youth looks like. This means that you have become kind of independent from foreign entities when it is regarding your economic growth as a state, as a country. Like for the youth in Kenya, this means that we're no longer depending on things like loans from foreign corporations or things like that, or like money does not easily come out, like we're not living from hand to mouth as like Kenyan youth. So affirmative action funds, once again, just means these are funding models that are targeted towards certain demographics within society that are going to be considered as vulnerable. This looks like targeting black-owned businesses and giving them money. That is like affirmative action funds. You're trying to push for social inclusion as opposed to things like economic dependence. Now we're done with definitions out of the way. One, let's look at our model. How do we think this is going to solve or further incentivize youth entrepreneurship? One, strategic sector identification is something we need to prioritize, because panel, if we're offering tax breaks to these people, we need to actually identify which sectors align with the sustainable development goals that exist within our region. This looks like if your company is pushing for things like food security, education, alleviation of poverty, those are certain sectors that the government is going to be more willing to give tax breaks to. So secondly, since we have these sectors already identified, we need to enforce certain tiers of tax breaks that companies may qualify for based on their respective scopes. This looks like essential industries are more like viable for tax breaks. For example, if you're focusing on agriculture, if you're focusing on like food allocation, that means you are more qualified for certain tax breaks that non-essential sectors like maybe real estate or emerging sectors like tech will still get tax breaks for, but not to the extent that these essential services get. Why do we think this is important? Radical protectionism. The state needs to be protected. Remember, we're already living in states that are plunged into debt, poverty, economic crisis. Therefore, if we were to prioritize essential industries and offer tax breaks to these youth-led companies, we are allowing them a greater opportunity to exist within the competitive market that already exists in status quo. We are allowing for them to be more sustainable, for them to actually emerge successful had they not had these tax breaks. This looks like if you're giving capital gains tax to a company that has been led by a 20-year-old, they are likely going to like burn out. That's why you're having things like startups having like to die very quickly in their early stages, because these companies are heavily burdened by these kinds of taxes. But if we offer that kind of break, then we feel like that kind of protectionism is already going to exist. And we're also going to prioritize domestic employment and local sourcing. This looks like tax deductions for companies that reach certain quotas, looking like you're employing people from your region, you're getting locally sourced materials from your region. And lastly, we have sunset clauses within these contracts that specify the end of these tax break periods to ensure that these things are not going to be exploited. This looks like after 5 years, your company can be audited and an economic impact assessment is done to ensure or to determine whether or not you still qualify for that form of tax break. Because once again, remember, the youth are still a vulnerable group in society. In the economic market, older people are the ones that kind of have that kind of monopoly, and we need to break this. My partner is going to talk about how like tax breaks are actually going to support a broader spectrum of youth, going to foster things like self-sufficiency and innovation, and even then, how government policy has caused these problems among the youth. They have lenient retirement policies that allow for older people to continuously exist within the economic markets. And even then, they mismanage funds to the point where the youth are not able to even like get certain forms of benefit. This looks like interns, the 46,000 JSS teachers have not been paid. The youth are largely being like overlooked and overshadowed. So it is principally justified that the government, being the people who caused these problems, should take the reins towards solving it by offering tax breaks to these youths to allow for mechanisms that cannot be scattered or corrupted against, and allow for these like youth to easily compete in a market that has already been saturated against their favor. Thank you.
Youth empowerment is not just a goal. It's the key of unlocking financial security and transforming lives. Therefore, as the opposers of this motion, we believe that affirmative action funds will pave way for brighter, more equitable future for everyone. I wonder why the props are profiling people in this situation. We want to bring everybody on board. We have people living with disabilities. They are talking about promoting other sectors. Why can't you include everyone in this, whatever you are advocating for? We believe that with affirmative action fund, we have targeted groups. And when we talk about targeted groups and targeted impact, we are talking about the Youth Enterprise Development Fund. For example, all of us are aware of the TVET. That is targeted. It is meant for those who are need of educational knowledge. So the government is having this kind of funds available for all those who are really in need of this kind of funds. Then we are trying to address the systemic inequality. Remember, we have the people living with disabilities, that is one. We have the women themselves. As the props are talking about, they are going to give certain percentages, they are going to allow certain sectors not to pay certain percentages. Why would you give somebody who is capable of paying tax to a leverage that they can't pay that tax? Yet, there are those who are deserving, those who would want that funds available for them to start a business and develop. Because we are talking about financial security. And financial security here is not dependent. We have to be independent. That is when we have financial security. The third thing we are talking about is immediate assistance. Remember, earlier on I talked about the TVET. The funds have been allocated for that particular group of people. Those are the needy people. We want to equip them with skills because we are going to train them. We are going to tell them how they can acquire these funds, use them well for their development. All these, when you practice them, you find that we are bringing everybody on board. Those who are deserving, those who are not deserving, because we want to create that financial security for everyone who is deserving and those who are not deserving, those who are capable of paying taxes. We don't want to let them pay certain percentages and not pay certain percentages, because when they do that, they are going to depend on these incentives. We don't want them to be dependent on the government to release the incentive rates so that they can start their businesses. We want these people to get the capital from the government, start their businesses, and pay tax as they are supposed to, not letting them out. My colleague is going to talk more about what we are advocating for as at this point, because clearly these people are ignorant. They don't know that when you want to motivate someone, you have to provide that environment for that person to grow. You can't motivate somebody from their capital. Provide that person with that capital first, so that when you want to motivate them, they have the funds, they have the environment which allows them to make that growth. But without that, we are not going to realize the financial security we are advocating for. Thank you.
Panel, how we approach the definitions of what tax breaks represent and what affirmative actions represent is very important for us to delineate, even in order for you to have an easier time in judging. How we view affirmative action is that it is a pathway for financial inclusion, right? And that is very important. We also come in and say that tax breaks that affirmative action is very important for people who had at one point not been or had been barred from or had a very difficult time accessing the market in the first place. Why? Because of being marginalized in the first place, economically speaking. This applies to the disabled, this applies to women, and this applies to youth, precisely because they had been marginalized by older people, by abled people, and by men in society. Now, financial inclusion is all well and good, and that is very important, and we concede that to their side. What we come in and tell you, panel, is that what our model of tax breaks advocate for goes beyond financial inclusion. It is not enough for the youth to just participate in the market. We have to guarantee a situation where the youth are winning in the economic market and they're actually gaining, right, from the economic market. And that is where the delineation comes in from our side. Panel, one of the first things that we tell you is because the youth had been marginalized in the first place, the rules of economic engagement were set without them being present in the room in the first place, right? And that is when you have financial inclusion, you're telling them these are the rules that have already been set. Now come in and participate. With tax breaks, it represents an avenue for us to ask, how can we make the economy work for the youth in the first place, right? Beyond them just participating in it, beyond us just giving them money and tell them now go into the market that has already been set and participate. That is the kind of arguments that we bring in from our side. My partner has already laid out the model and how it looks like in terms of how tax breaks are going to be allocated towards essential services, towards non-essential services, and all of those kinds of things. But panel, we think now because we have provided a model, it is my job as the second speaker to defend why exactly we are advocating for radical protectionism. Now, we think radical protectionism is something that helps very much in terms of vibrancy, in terms of ensuring that people are not just participating, but they're looking to dominate and they're looking to win within the economic market. Now, think of, for example, about how comes to government economic policies, they are dependent on the strength of their domestic economy. Look at, for example, the domestic employment and local sourcing policies that the United States has employed, whereby you have tax deductions for companies that reach a certain quota of local involvement, participation, and employment. Think, for example, of the U.S. Work Opportunity Tax Program that offers deduction for domestic sourcing and labor. Those kinds of policies fundamentally question what is the role of the domestic economy and how can we shape the national economy around those who are the principal actors of the domestic economy, as opposed to just saying, here you go, the money that you have with the current market as it is, participate, right? We think, first of all, panel, we've already told you how youth look like when it comes to starting up companies. You have to deal with things like tax compliance, licenses that are involved in that, and you have to do that all while ensuring that you're breaking even in the company that you're already running. It is very difficult to navigate all of those issues at once as a startup company, and therefore tax breaks are important in order to ensure that the youth have a higher chance of succeeding and not just participating in the economy. Now, we've already, now that I've talked about that, my partner already has also told you that it's easier to get away with saying, I will not pay you the money that you need for affirmative action, as opposed to demanding that you pay me for tax, right? So even when it comes to corruption, it is easier for us to have tax breaks that are less manipulated in our world because, I am not going to pay you, as opposed to affirmative action where funding is guaranteed on government actually giving you the money in the first place. Of course, we have the issues of the marginalization and the rules on all of that, but I feel like I've already affirmed a lot of the points you've had to say, and our model works with that. I rest.
I'm Derek from the Cooperative University. When I look at you, I know you have a business idea, right? But, you don't have capital. Wow. That's what these guys are not telling you, that affirmative action provides the capital. But on their case, the break tax, it's only for people who have access to resources to start the business. Let me give you an example, a real life example in this Kenya. about tax breaks and affirmative action. We see youth, maybe in those with boda, they don't have those shields, those Jua shield. There are also youths who are in the market. They don't have markets. So there's a pay bill that it's for buy goods and services. Buy goods and services, you are not taxed. But imagine a scenario where you have a buy goods and services, but when it is raining, you don't have anywhere to work. But affirmative action, it provides capital. And capital is not all about money. It's also about asset. Build that market. The youth will work forever and he will have the financial security, or she. You see? That's the scenario. Our opponents here, what they are not telling you also is that tax breaks don't provide education and training. In our case, about affirmative action, you'll be provided with seminars, training, and you'll be trained about the new trends in the technology. You know, that's some of the advantages of the affirmative action. They're talking about inclusivity. Inclusivity. Let me ask you, which is that inclusivity? People who don't have capital are not access to. When you talk about accessibility and inclusivity, Youth Enterprise Development Fund in Kenya provides loan and grants to young entrepreneurs who may not have access to traditional financing. This fund specifically targets youth from marginalized community, ensuring inclusivity. In contrast, tax breaks might primarily benefit those who already have the means to start a business, potentially excluding the most vulnerable. The other thing, I want to say this. Give a man a fish and you'll feed him for a day, but teach a man to fish and you'll feed him in lifetime. Just provide capital, then all is done. Thank you. Rest my case.
Panel, my partner already tells you that the affirmative action funding model is what exists in status quo. Now, if all the benefits that they're bringing to us have already existed in status quo and have proven to fail, we don't see why this is something we should largely buy into. This means the entire idea that George and I have come to tell you, that money is still being allocated by the government in the form of affirmative action, yet it doesn't reach the people, yet the people largely do not benefit from these. And even these economic programs that they are bringing about, they have not done the legwork to show us why this is something that is even going to exist in a society where education is largely not something that has been prioritized. And even then, we tell you that when offering tax breaks to people, education still already exists. You can still take an economics class when you're still benefiting from things like tax breaks. Capital cannot be the problem. We told you government policies are the problems that the youth are facing, and it is inherently why these people have issues to do with unemployment and poverty. Now, if the government already capitalizes on a model that we have brought forth to you, whereby these youth-led companies no longer need to be burdened with the problems of overtaxation and overexploitation, we feel like that they are then more incentivized to compete inside these markets. Remember, they're not working in an individual basis where they're all youth. They're working in like a large scale where they're competing with various markets. So if we allow for them to have a bit of a break in terms of like the taxes that they are liable for or they're supposed to pay, we feel like largely this promotes sustainability within the youth sector. This promotes a certain form of diversity economically, and even then the states gain some form of economic independence. That protection that these African states largely deserve is something that we are pushing for from side proposition, and those benefits cannot be found in their world. Thank you.
First of all, the affirmative action has not failed. In fact, do you know about GAF? Many people is that they don't know that it is accessible or how to access those funds. But you can go maybe to Google account, you access the GAF and you apply yourself. Is that affirmative action? Watu wengi hawajui kuna stuff kayo. Okay, sorry for that. But I'll tell you that many youth business face a high risk of failure due to lack of experience, inadequate business networks, and limited market opportunities. And that can only be done through training and educating stuffs like technology, new skills. Yeah, I rest my case.
Yeah, I think for round 2, you brought back better cases and better energy. I'll move straight to the analysis. Let me read the motion just for the audience. Incentivizing youth entrepreneurship through tax breaks is a better way to achieve financial security for the youth in Kenya than through affirmative action funds. I know saying affirmative action funds is a long word, so I assumed every time you were saying affirmative action, you meant affirmative action funds. Next time you can just like abbreviate to like AAF, which we'll understand. So the incentivizing for entrepreneurship is in two forms. Either a tax break, in this case, Team Prop is for tax break, Team Op is for affirmative action funds. Both teams did a good job setting the model for whether a tax break or whether an AAF. Now, the element that was sort of the defining factor was the financial security element. Should you talk about a tax break, how does that inform what financial security for a young person in Kenya looks like? I'll go to Team Prop. Team Prop, you give us what a tax break is, very well contextualized. You show us who exactly benefits, what sectors benefit, and how a tax break is manifested in the context of Kenya, which is well and good. You miss me at defining what financial security for a young person in Kenya looks like. Because your definition was any independence from foreign institutions when it comes to economic freedom. And I was asking myself, should Citibank Dubai give me a loan that is at 6% interest per annum, and KCB Bank Kenya is giving me a loan that is at 13% interest per annum? Is there a problem for a young person to get that loan from Citibank Dubai? So that beats the definition of what financial security looks like for a young person. Having access to funds from a foreign institution doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. Is it a fair debt? Is it highly accessible? Does it have flexible payment terms? Those are elements of financial security a young person would prefer. So I think that would have been a better definition rather than who the institution is. The question is, how is the institution providing that level of financial inclusion? Your first speaker talks about that when you allocate a capital gains tax to a young entrepreneur, it is restrictive. And the question that I was asking myself, how many young entrepreneurs actually make enough turnover to be charged a capital gains tax? In my understanding of the Finance Bill 2024, it's at 500 million Kenyan shillings. The young entrepreneur does not make that kind of money. So again, profiling young entrepreneurs in Kenya is very critical when you argue for tax breaks. Now, do tax breaks exist in the system? They do. Do they exist for the sectors you were talking about? Yes. Medical sectors get this. Developers that are building greenhouses or affordable housing, they do get tax rebates and tax break. So that already exists. The question I wanted to know from your end, which is how you would have defended better, is, does the young entrepreneur have a tax problem or a capital problem? This is where Team Op was poking your holes. And they're talking about the young marginalized startup founder in Turkana, Moyale, Baringo. We need to stop thinking about this demographic as Nairobi alone. Do they have an access to capital issue, or do they have a tax problem? So this is where you furnish your argument with statistics to build your case. But otherwise, the model was superb. It makes sense why to implement it. Just give us, validate, justify why the young entrepreneur has a tax problem and not a capital problem.
Team Prop, we're looking at incentivizing youth entrepreneurship. Perhaps what we would want to look at is one of the examples that you gave were like what an essential industry would look like. And when you started mentioning agriculture, I was like, these people know what they were looking for. But then when we start speaking of agriculture, how exactly are we incentivizing youth entrepreneurship in agriculture? For example, we are encouraging diversity in the kind of crops that this country wants to grow. So are we going to incentivize any youth that, for instance, decides to do maize farming? Or what exactly would the metrics be for someone who decides to continue with maize farming and one who decides to do the avocado farming that we allege would grow for 3 months and can be exported? So how would that work? And then the other bit is, how exactly would these tax breaks survive through the, like I'm looking at the legal or the political environments around these incentivizing the youth entrepreneurship. Now, side up, when we start speaking about providing capital, and we are for that, affirmative action funds would be the best way of doing it. But then we are looking at, we want to teach someone how to fish. How exactly will we, or how sure are we that this person has learned how to fish? I'm looking at us giving these people funds and whether we are going to follow up on whether these funds are existing, because then that would mean their case stands if they are running on these entrepreneurships existing, and now these people now need the tax breaks and the kind of licenses that they operate within. And then we now want you guys to also look at this capital aspect and the kind of follow-ups that we're going to be having, or the kind of cushions that we're going to be providing this youth to ensure that whatever they are running through will grant them financial security. Thank you to both teams.